The beach looks like the end of the world. After a hurricane that ripped the sky open, the shore is a graveyard of twisted metal and shattered wood. 3 survivors, Liam, a rugged ex-Coast Guard, Sophia, a nurse with trauma in her eyes, and Noah, a tech millionaire whose wealth couldn't buy a life jacket, are huddled together. They are the definition of wreckage, soaked to the bone, shivering in the freezing wind, and coated in a layer of oily black mud. Every breath is a struggle against the salt-heavy air that clings to their lungs. But in the center of the carnage sits something that shouldn't exist. A 7-year-old girl in a pristine, blindingly white dress. Her golden hair isn't just dry, it's fluffy as if it was just blow-dried. Her skin is clean, glowing with a soft matte finish. Even her patent leather shoes are free of a single grain of sand. She looks like she stepped out of a high-end portrait and onto a battlefield of debris. Liam, driven by instinct, offers her his canteen. She takes it with a small, silent nod. But as she brings it to her mouth, Noah, the man who spent his life analyzing data, notices something impossible. The water inside the clear bottle doesn't level out with gravity. It bends away from her lips, creating a perfect hollow curve, as if an invisible magnetic force is pushing the liquid back into the plastic. The storm destroyed everything. It killed dozens. But in the middle of the carnage they found her. She doesn't speak. She doesn't cry. And as the survivors struggle to stay alive, they notice the most terrifying thing of all. Despite the rain, the waves, and the humid air, she is bone dry. The water isn't just avoiding her, it's afraid of her. Who is the girl that the ocean refuses to touch? To survive the night, they have to uncover a secret that was never meant to reach the surface. The aftermath of Hurricane Alara felt like a fever dream. The sky was a bruised, sickly yellow, and the Atlantic was still churning with a violent, rhythmic anger. Liam, Sophia, and Noah were huddled on a narrow, shrinking sandbar, a thin strip of land that was slowly being devoured by the rising tide. Every few minutes, a wave would surge over the edges, pulling more sand into the black depths. The survivors were a mess of human desperation. Liam's Coast Guard uniform was ripped and heavy with salt water. Sophia was shivering so hard her teeth rattled against her lip, her nurse's scrubs stained with the oily grime of the yacht's engine room, and Noah was clutching his side, his expensive silk shirt now a muddy rag. They were wet, cold, and exhausted, their skin pruned and pale from hours of exposure. Then they saw her. In the center of the sandbar, sitting on a plush piece of red velvet that had drifted from the yacht's luxury lounge, was the girl. She looked like she was waiting for a bus, not surviving a shipwreck. Liam, driven by the instinct to protect, stumbled through the rising water toward her. "Hey kid, we have to move," he shouted over the wind. The tide was coming in fast, and the sandbar would be gone in less than an hour. He reached down, intending to scoop her up and carry her to the jagged rocks of the nearby cliff. But as his hands moved toward her small shoulders, his arms suddenly locked in midair. It wasn't a physical wall, but something far more unsettling. Liam felt a static barrier, a dense, invisible pressure that pushed back against his palms with the strength of 2 massive magnets repelling one another. No matter how much weight he put behind it, his hands stopped exactly 1 inch from her skin. He could feel the air between them vibrating, humming with a high-frequency energy that made the hair on his arms stand straight up. He looked down at the velvet cushion she was sitting on. It was bone dry. Not a single drop of the torrential rain had managed to soak the fabric. Sophia pushed past Liam, her medical instincts taking over. "Let me try, I'm a nurse," she said, though her voice lacked conviction. She reached out to check the girl's pulse, her fingers trembling. She met the same invisible resistance. As she stared at the girl, Sophia noticed something that made the blood freeze in her veins. The rain was still pouring from the dark clouds above, but as the droplets fell toward Lily, they didn't land. They swerved. In midair, the water arched away from her as if repelled by an invisible dome, creating a perfect 3-foot dry zone. Inside that circle, the air was still, and the sand was as fine and powdery as a desert dune. Lily just looked at them, her eyes wide and ancient, her white dress rustling in a wind that they couldn't feel. While Liam and Sophia struggled with the physical impossibility of the girl, Noah had crawled over to a waterlogged leather binder that had washed up near his feet. It was the yacht's official manifest, a record of every guest and crew member. He flipped through the pulpy, dripping pages, his eyes scanning for a name, a family, anything that explained who this child was. He found a section titled Historical Artifacts and Records. The yacht owner had been a collector of maritime history. Noah stopped at a scanned image of a black and white photograph. His heart skipped a beat. In the photo, a girl was wearing the exact same white dress, holding the same silent expression. But the caption beneath it sent a jolt of pure terror through him. The manifest listed the girl's name as Lily, and stated she was a passenger who had perished in the sinking of the Titanic in April of 1912. The environment didn't just change around Lily, it surrendered. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, the survivors noticed the dry zone wasn't static. It was breathing, pulsing, and slowly expanding. Wherever the girl took a step, the water didn't just move, it vanished. The deep, murky puddles on the sandbar would hiss and evaporate into a thin, white mist the moment her shadow touched them. Even the wreckage of the yacht began to react. The heavy, waterlogged mahogany beams that had been dripping with sea foam just minutes ago were now turning a pale, sickly gray. The wood was becoming brittle, the moisture sucked out so violently that the timber began to crack and splinter with a sound like pistol shots echoing across the shore. But for Liam, Sophia, and Noah, the scientific wonder was quickly replaced by a primal, agonizing thirst. Their bodies were already screaming for hydration after the salt air exposure, but the island was becoming a desert in the middle of an ocean. Noah reached for the last undamaged gallon of emergency water they had salvaged from the debris. As Lily drifted closer, his eyes widened in horror. The clear liquid inside the plastic jug began to cloud and churn. It didn't just disappear, it underwent a rapid, violent chemical shift. Within seconds, the fresh water had crystallized into a solid block of jagged, gray salt. Every source of life they had was being neutralized by her mere presence. They were surrounded by millions of gallons of water, yet they were dying of thirst in a 3-foot circle of dust. The psychological cracks began to show as the physical pain set. Their skin felt tight, like it was 2 sizes too small, and their throats burned with every breath of the bone-dry air Lily radiated. Liam, the man of action, gripped his flare gun, his eyes tracking the girl with a growing, jagged hatred. To him, she was an invasive predator, a monster, in a white dress that was slowly mummifying them alive. Sophia, however, knelt in the parched sand, watching the way the girl looked at the horizon. She saw a miracle, a divine shield against the chaotic cruelty of the storm. Noah stayed in the middle, his tech-driven mind trying to calculate the biological anomaly. He whispered about quantum displacement and glitches in the physical fabric of reality, his fingers tracing the cracked, dry earth as if searching for a reset button. The debate was cut short by a sound that made the earth tremble. A king tide, a massive 30-foot wall of black Atlantic water, was roaring toward the sandbar, fueled by the receding hurricane's energy. It was a skyscraper of salt and fury, moving with a speed that left no room for escape. Liam screamed for them to run toward the cliffs, but their feet were heavy and the sand was shifting. They huddled together behind the girl, bracing for the impact that would surely crush their bones and pull them into the abyss. They closed their eyes, feeling the cold spray on their faces, waiting for the end. The impact never came. There was a thunderous, tearing sound, like a silk sheet being ripped in half by a giant. Noah opened his eyes and gasped. The wave hadn't hit them. 10 feet in front of Lily, the wall of water had split perfectly down the middle. It was flowing around their camp like it had hit a glass prow, carving a massive roaring canyon into the sea. The survivors stood in absolute silence, paralyzed with awe. They were standing on a patch of dusty, cracked earth, bone-dry and untouched, while a mountain of ocean thundered past them on either side. They were at the bottom of the sea, and the only thing keeping the world from collapsing on them was a 7-year-old girl who didn't even have a pulse. The dry zone was no longer a sanctuary, it was an appetite. As the roar of the split ocean continued to echo around them, Noah crawled toward a titanium-reinforced briefcase that had been wedged between 2 jagged rocks. He bypassed the biometric lock with a portable deck, his eyes bloodshot and stinging from the lack of humidity. Inside, he didn't find jewelry or cash. He found a series of encrypted drives and a folder marked with a government seal, Project Hydrophobe. As he scrolled through the files, the truth began to bleed out. Lily wasn't a ghost from 1912, and she wasn't a miracle. She was a molecular anchor, a biological weapon engineered in a deep-sea trench facility. The manifest he had found earlier was a cover, a fake historical artifact used to transport her. Lily was designed to be the ultimate naval deterrent. She was a living void, capable of destabilizing the molecular bond of $H_20 on a massive scale. She didn't avoid water, she consumed the very idea of it. The dry zone was merely the event horizon of a vacuum that lived inside her chest. The documents described her as an inhaling force, a creature that could dehydrate an entire carrier strike group in minutes by pulling the moisture directly out of the air, the fuel, and the lungs of the sailors. During the chaos of Hurricane Alara, her containment unit had failed, and the weapon had walked off the yacht and into the world. The horror was no longer theoretical, it was becoming physical. Noah looked at his hands and let out a choked, dry sob. His skin was no longer just dry, it was becoming translucent and brittle, like the wings of a dead insect. The void inside Lily was growing, fueled by the king tide she had just split. Every molecule of water she absorbed made her anchor stronger, and the cost was being paid by everything around her. The lush tropical ferns that had survived the storm were now literally turning to white ash and blowing away in a wind that felt like a furnace blast. The survivors were being mummified while they still breathed, their skin cracking in deep, bloodless fissures as the moisture was ripped from their cells. Liam watched as a piece of driftwood near Lily's feet didn't just dry out, it spontaneously combusted into a fine gray powder. He realized that the dry zone was expanding with every heartbeat. They were standing in a desert that was growing at an exponential rate. "She's not saving us," Liam rasped, his voice sounding like sandpaper on stone. "She's eating the world to keep herself stable." He looked at Lily, who was standing perfectly still, her white dress fluttering in an invisible draft created by the air rushing into the vacuum she occupied. She looked more like a statue than a girl, a silent, beautiful predator that didn't even know it was killing them. Sophia, who had been staring out at the canyon of water, suddenly pointed a trembling finger toward the horizon. "Look," she whispered, the word barely audible. The thundering walls of the split ocean weren't just staying back, they were receding. The water was pulling away from the sandbar, not just miles, but toward the very edge of the horizon. It wasn't a tide and it wasn't a tsunami withdrawal. The entire Atlantic Ocean was being dragged backward, the waves flattening and the seabed being exposed as a barren, muddy wasteland. Lily wasn't just repelling the sea anymore, she was inhaling it. The massive weight of the ocean was being sucked into the 3-foot space occupied by a 7-year-old girl. The air was no longer a gas, it was a blade. Every time Liam, Sophia, or Noah took a breath, it felt like swallowing crushed glass. The dry zone had expanded into a shimmering, distorted dome of heat that made the horizon wobble like a broken transmission. The survivors were in the final stages of a total biological collapse. Their tongues had swollen into thick, dry lumps of sandpaper that made speech impossible. Their eyes had retreated into dark, hollow pits, the lack of fluid making every blink a jagged, agonizing scratch across their corneas. They were dying of thirst in the middle of the Atlantic, their bodies turning into brittle husks while the roar of the receding ocean taunted them from the distance. Liam, fueled by the primal adrenaline of a dying man, looked at Lily. To him, the innocent white dress was now a shroud. He realized that the anchor wasn't just a part of her, it was her. If they didn't act, the void inside her would eventually inhale enough of the planet's moisture to tip the global scales. He croaked a plan to Sophia through cracked lips. They had to push her. They had to force her into the deep water where the sheer volume of the Atlantic might overload her capacity, short-circuiting the molecular vacuum before she could consume them all. It was a desperate, murderous gamble, but on a sandbar made of dust and bone, morality had evaporated hours ago. The chase that followed was a cinematic nightmare in slow motion. The survivors were too weak to run. They had to crawl through the parched sand, their fingernails snapping against the dry, hardened earth. It looked like a procession of the damned. Lily didn't run. She didn't even hurry. She just drifted across the sandbar with a calm, eerie grace, her footsteps leaving no mark on the ground. Every few feet, she would stop and look back at them with those huge porcelain-white eyes, eyes that held no malice, only an infinite, terrifying emptiness. The closer they got to her, the more the air felt thin, as if the oxygen itself was being stripped of its hydrogen bonds. Noah, driven by a tech-obsessed delusion that he could recalibrate her, lunged forward. He saw the silver locket around her neck, the anchor mentioned in the Project Hydrophobe files. He thought if he could just snap the chain the field would collapse. But the moment his fingertips crossed the 3-foot threshold of her inner dry zone, the world went silent. There was no scream. There was only the sound of a sudden violent whoosh. In less than 3 seconds, the moisture was ripped from Noah's pores with such force that his skin turned a dark, leathery brown instantly. His muscles shriveled against his bones, and his eyes literally evaporated into his skull. He collapsed into a mummified husk, a statue of salt and dust that shattered when it hit the ground. Liam and Sophia froze, their hearts hammering in chests that felt like they were filled with hot coals. The tech millionaire who had tried to solve the world with code was now just a gray smudge on the sand. Lily stopped. She didn't look at the remains of Noah. She looked at Liam, her head tilting slightly to the side. For the first time her lips moved. The sound that came out wasn't a human voice. It was the dry, rhythmic crackling of autumn leaves being crushed under a heavy boot. It was the sound of a desert wind howling through a sun-bleached ribcage. She whispered 3 words that chilled them more than the hurricane ever could. "I'm so thirsty." The end didn't come with a whimper, it came with the weight of the entire Atlantic. Liam and Sophia reached the edge of the jagged limestone cliffs, their legs moving like leaden weights. Behind them, the horizon had vanished. A massive 200-foot wall of black water, the ocean finally rebounding from Lily's repulsion, was towering over the island like the hand of God. It was a mega tsunami of pressurized fury, fueled by the vacuum Lily had created. But as Sophia stared into the dark heart of the oncoming wave, her nurse's training saw something the others had missed. The water wasn't just dark, it was a thick, viscous crimson. A toxic red tide of prehistoric algae, churned up from the deep-sea trenches by the hurricane. The realization hit Sophia with the force of a physical blow. Lily wasn't an anchor designed for destruction, she was a filter. The government documents Noah had found were only half true. She was a biological containment system. She wasn't absorbing water to be cruel, she was desperately pulling the moisture out of the atmosphere to create a barrier against the toxic sludge that would have decimated the entire coastline. She was a living shield, absorbing the poison into the void within her so the world wouldn't have to. The thirst she had whispered about wasn't for water, it was for the burden she was carrying. Liam looked at Sophia and then at the girl. The hatred in his eyes flickered and died, replaced by a crushing sense of shame. They had treated her like a monster while she was holding back a continental extinction. As the 200-foot wall of water began its final descent, Liam and Sophia didn't run. They moved toward Lily. They crossed into the dry zone, ignoring the searing pain as their skin tightened and their cells screamed. They reached out and grasped each other's hands, forming a human chain with Lily at the center. They accepted the dryness. They chose to be part of the shield. The skyscraper of water crashed down with a sound that should have leveled the island. But as the toxic crimson wave hit Lily's barrier, the impossible happened. The kinetic energy didn't shatter them. Instead, the water underwent a total phase change. The moment the liquid touched the edge of the dry zone, it bypassed the boiling point and turned directly into a shimmering, harmless white mist. A beautiful, prismatic fog enveloped the cliffside, smelling not of rot, but of pure oxygen. The toxic algae was neutralized, its molecular structure dismantled by the vacuum and dropped as harmless dust onto the parched earth. Weeks later, a rescue helicopter spotted 2 figures on the jagged rocks. Liam and Sophia were found sitting in the center of a perfectly circular patch of white sand. They were alive, but they were different. The medical teams at the Naval Hospital couldn't explain it. Their internal organs had undergone a crystalline shift. Their kidneys were no longer processing liquid, their skin no longer sweated. They had become biological anomalies who no longer needed to drink a single drop of water to survive. They were dry-state humans, forever marked by the girl who saved the world. Lily was gone. No body was ever found and no wreckage remained. But in the exact coordinates where the yacht had vanished, a new geographic wonder appeared. A permanent island of dryness now exists in the middle of the Atlantic. It is a place where the water stops 10 feet from the shore, bending away into a perfect glassy wall. The land is always parched and the sky is always clear. She didn't just survive the storm, she ended it. But somewhere out there she's still walking, and the ocean is still running away. The world thinks it's safe, but the sea remembers. If you found a child who could kill you just by standing near you, would you run for your life, or would you have the courage to hold her hand?